Well, once again, we turn our attention to the book of Joshua. And if you would go in your Bible or Bible app to Joshua chapter 10, we will pick up the story from last week as we looked at chapter 9. You will notice we've been going fairly quickly, almost a whole chapter, if not a whole chapter each sermon. So we're going to put the brakes on this morning. We're going to slow it down just a bit. And I say that because for two reasons. Number one, chapter 10 actually has either 2 or 3 different pericopes in it, depending on how you interpret verse 15 in the chapter. It's possible that when it says that Joshua and the fighting men went back to Gilgal, that they did so immediately, thus breaking from the next section, or that actually was something that occurred after the pericope of verse 15. That's worthy of a full discussion in itself, and I'm going to hold that for next week, Lord willing. So it's possible that there's 2 or 3 pericopes in this passage, so it's going to need 2 or 3 different sermons. But secondly, due to the fact that we will be celebrating the Lord's Supper this morning, I need to shorten my time with you, so therefore we're going to just limit the number of verses that we work on today. That works out just fine, because I think verses 1 to 15 deserve a sermon all by themselves anyways. So that's where we're going to go. In the first 2 verses of this chapter, we see once again the enemies of Israel conspiring together to come against Israel. As soon as Adonizedek, the king of Jerusalem, heard how Joshua had captured Ai and had devoted to destruction, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were warriors. And then it goes on in verses 3 and 4 to speak of this king building an alliance of other kings. The man's name is Adonizedek. That sounds similar to Melchizedek. The Z-E-D-E-K at the end of that is the same, because both men were in fact either the king or lord of the city of Jerusalem, or Salem as it would have been known in the days of Melchizedek. Both of these men have the suffix of righteousness or of peace in that Zedek. However, this man, of course, does not at all reflect the character of a man of righteousness or a man of peace, but quite the contrary. He is, according to verse 5, an Amorite. So he is one of the Amorite kings of Canaan. He is the king over the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem at this time, 1400 years before Christ, is actually just another city-state amongst the various Canaanite city-states. The Israelites will not actually conquer this city, either in the initial conquest, as you can see in Joshua chapter 15, verse 63, nor in the days of the judges, as you will see in Judges chapter 1 and verse 21. It will remain a Jebusite stronghold in the center of Canaan all the way to the days of David. David will finally conquer this city in 1003 BC, according to 2 Samuel 5:6, and make it the capital of the United Kingdom of Israel. It will remain as the capital of Israel until the divided kingdom under Rehoboam and Jeroboam I, but it will be the stronghold of Israel into the future. Not, however, until the days of David, 400 years in the future. This man had a fear, and rightly so, of an alliance made between Gibeon and the Israelites, verse 2. That alliance, of course, is outlined in the previous chapter, the covenant relationship between the Gibeonites and the Israelites that came by virtue of them coming through a ruse to establish a covenant relationship with Israel. That's what we talked about last week. We are told here that Gibeon is a quote-unquote royal city, which means that it is a city that is ruled outward, has a king that rules outward over other nearby cities. You remember back in chapter 9, verse 17, we learned that there are 3 other cities, Chephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. These are probably 3 other cities that don't have kings of themselves but are ruled over by Gibeon's king, and so it's an alliance of city-states in a small area. Jerusalem was probably the same. A royal city, it had a king, we know his name, and ruled over several other city-states around him. The king feared because of the combined strength now of the Gibeonites and the Israelites. The Gibeonites were already a powerful force, but now with the Israelites making a covenant with them, that force is only increased. And so this king decides to establish an alliance with some surrounding cities. Now, I say surrounding with a certain amount of question. I'm not really sure whether they're surrounding because we're not really sure where most of these cities actually are. But let's assume that the king of Jerusalem gathers around him some local kings of other kinds of royal cities and draws them together. Now, in my opinion, and Calvin's opinion in his commentary on this book, this is the same alliance that is mentioned in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. Both these 2 chapters begin with the mention of an alliance, and I am convinced that this is actually the same alliance. That there's no new alliance, this is the same one, and that all that Joshua is doing in chapter 10 is being more specific as to who these kings are, because now that alliance of kings will come into play. And you'll notice in chapter 9 it didn't matter. They weren't involved in the story beyond the first 2 verses. But now in this case they are, and so I think Joshua just comes along and says, okay, let me tell you who they are. Okay, so you have the king of Jerusalem, and then you have the king of Hebron, which is ruled by Hoham, Jarmuth, which is ruled by Param, and Lachish by Japhia, and Eglon by Debir. So now these men, these kings, take a posture of directly coming against Gibeon. Notice the end of verse 5. And the king of Eglon gathered forces and went up with all their armies and encamped against Gibeon and made war against it. They came against Gibeon. They took on an offense against the city of Gibeon. They undoubtedly concluded that the best defense is an offense in this case. We have to protect Jerusalem, so what we're going to do is we're going to attack directly. Instead of fortifying their own cities and protecting themselves, they decided to go on the offense. Now, I mentioned last week quite prominently, you remember, that this is the response of the reprobate heart to God. The response of the reprobate heart when the judgment of God is announced is to rise up in even greater rebellion. The reprobate heart responds to the coming announcement, or the announcement of the coming of the judgment of God, by rebelling even more. In other words, these kings, instead of recognizing the power of the God of the Israelites, which the king of Jerusalem knows came against Jericho and Ai. I mean, he says that in the text. He knows that. He knows that there is a great power there. He knows as well that this God is purposing something in Canaan. But instead of coming, seeking the mercy of God, what does he do? He chooses instead to try to attack the very Israelites and Gibeonites, thus the God behind the Israelites and the Gibeonites. They choose to try to overthrow them, that is the Israelites, and God. So there's a very basic principle that you need to always keep in mind, and this is something that should help you to understand why it is that people in this world act the way they do. The reprobate heart hates God and will never submit to his authority. That is the condition of the human race. The Bible is clear about this. Human beings are not born into this world innocent and looking for God, seeking after God. Paul is quite clear in Romans 3, there is no one who seeks God. The reprobate heart hates God and will do whatever he can to fight against God. And until we get that principle clearly in mind, we find ourselves being confused as to why it is that men act the way that they do. Well, why do they do that? I mean, they know that leads to death. They know that leads to destruction. They know that leads to lack of human flourishing, why do they do that? Because their hearts are hard, and because they hate their Creator, and because they want to rebel against Him. We got to start there. By the way, I've often said that a proper theology must begin not only with a right understanding of who God is, but a right understanding of who we are. So, in verses 6 and 7, Joshua responds to this because the Gibeonites make a request. The covenant that was made in chapter 9 has two sides, okay? All covenants do, in fact, have two sides. This one has two sides. First, the covenant that the Israelites made with the Gibeonites protects the Gibeonites from being destroyed. Okay? So, the Gibeonites have secured a promise from the Israelites that the Israelites will not wipe them out. They will not overthrow their cities like they did in Ai. But the other side of the covenant is also that Israel would actually defend the Gibeonites from all other forces that would attempt to come and destroy them. Not only will Israel say, okay, we won't destroy you, but we will also, in this covenant, protect you from others who may try to destroy you. Let me remind you of the ruse, okay? When the Gibeonites came to make this covenant, they came claiming to be from a far-off land. They came coming to be a people who lived outside of Canaan, who had heard of the Israelites and had come, but sent as a delegation to come and to make an arrangement. That is the assumption that the Israelites made when they bought the ruse. They were making a covenant with a distant king and alliance, and therefore they were making a covenant that was bidirectional. We will not only not attack you, but we will come and defend you in the event that you are attacked. The ruse itself is what caused this particular covenant to be developed in this way. In other words, it was more than a covenant, it was an alliance. It was a relationship. In fact, you will notice that it says in the end of verse 1, how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them. Okay? There's an intertwining now of these people together. So the covenant was first a passive promise, leave us alone, but it was also an active one, and an active side. There was an expectation amongst the Gibeonites that when they were attacked, they would be protected by the Israelites. So they appealed to the Israelites to fulfill their agreement. Do not relax your hand from your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the hill country are gathered against us. They send a message and say, hey, we're being attacked. Come and defend us. So Joshua recognizes this covenant, verse 7, and takes his fighting forces from Gilgal to Gibeon. Now, last week I contended, and I argued very successfully at this, that Yahweh had purposed for the Gibeonites to be a remnant in Canaan. That God had purposed for these people to be saved. And I offered, you remember, several reasons why I thought that was true, including the fact that these people acted like the elect do. In contrast to these reprobates who rebelled more against God, these were people who, upon hearing the judgment of God, responded with, I need mercy, and came to the Israelites looking for such mercy in the face of judgment. And even though this covenant was secured by a ruse, it was interesting, and I had not thought of this, I will admit that, I had not thought of this, but there were some of you, several of you in fact, who pointed out to me another ruse that had been undertaken in the past, prior even to this dialogue, which was used to secure a covenant. And that, of course, you remember, is the ruse of Jacob fooling his father into giving him, rather than Esau, the blessing. Jacob had already tricked his brother out of his birthright, but he also tricked him out of his father's blessing, even though God had specifically told his mother, even before Jacob was born, that the older would serve the younger. So God allowed and used the ruse to fulfill what he had already purposed. Okay? So, you see, I'm absolutely right on this point. As some of you have already noticed, you see. But, let me suggest to you, in order to put the final nail in this argument, that this chapter also offers an excellent reason why this contention must be true. It is the Lord himself who fights against the enemies of Gibeon. It is the Lord himself who comes and fights on behalf of these people that he has as a remnant. It starts in verse 8 when the Lord says to Joshua, "Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands." He doesn't say, "I will give them." What does he say? "I have already given them." Past tense. I have given them. I have predetermined that these people will be yours. It has already been determined and ordained that those who come to fight against Gibeon will be destroyed. But Yahweh himself intervenes, I would say miraculously, to destroy the Amorites, using Israel as the means to mop up the rest once he has acted against them directly. God fights for the Gibeonites. Now, I know, down in verse 14 it says that the Lord fought for Israel. Okay, I see it, I recognize it. But again, as I argued before, the connection between Israel and Gibeon is so strong by virtue of the covenant that when God comes to fight for one, he's fighting for the other as well, because they are one. So when it says that he fought for Israel, it also implies he is fighting for both. And verse 11 even goes so far as to says that the Lord killed more than Israel did with her swords. So this is Yahweh himself intervening to destroy the Amorites. It is God who now steps into this reality in time and space. And his interventions come in three specific ways. First, in verse 10, it says that the Lord throws them, that is, the fighting forces coming against Gibeon, into a panic before Israel, who then struck them with a great blow at Gibeon and chased them away. The Lord throws these Amorite fighters into a state of great panic. Now, the naturalistic explanation here, of course, is that the appearance of the forces of Joshua coming up over the hill, along with the forces of Gibeon, causes them to panic. That would be the naturalistic explanation. Okay, whatever. They just saw the forces coming, and the result of that is that they responded in great fear. But why the statement regarding the Lord doing this? Why would Joshua write it that way? You will notice he specifically says the Lord puts them into a panic. So I am convinced here that what actually happens is that God sends angelic messengers into the enemy camp who whisper words of doom to them, which causes them to panic before Joshua. Now, I can't prove that from this text, that there were angels coming. There's no mention of them in the text. But a little sanctified speculation suggests that the way by which you get people to panic is you whisper into their ears things that make them afraid. How do you get someone to suddenly turn from being confident enough to come with their armed forces against Gibeon, knowing that Gibeon is a royal city, knowing they're going to be defended by Israel, having that arrogance of coming and attacking, and then all of a sudden being thrown into a great panic? I mean, they already knew the size of the Israelites. Somebody whispered something in their ear, don't you think? Seems reasonable and logical to me that the Lord sent one of his messengers, or maybe a few of his messengers, to go and infiltrate the camp of the Gibeon of the armies of Jerusalem and the others, and whisper words of fear. You're going to die. You're all going to die. Run. You can kind of smell it, can't you? But there's a second intervention. And you see it in verse 11. As Israel then, the force coming over the hill, chases these Amorites away to the south, it says, the Lord as they fled, while they were going down the ascent of Beth-horon, the Lord threw down large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed with the sword. Now, you'll see that the first part of the verse just uses the word stones, but then Joshua clarifies what kind of stones are being thrown against. Their actual composition is being clarified. Now, again, the naturalistic explanation is, well, they just had the unfortunate choice of choosing a day in which great thunderstorms rolled up in Beth-horon, and they were killed by them. That's the naturalistic explanation. They had the bad luck to run into large hailstorms. But you know what? Hailstorms don't typically kill people in this number. At least none that I've ever heard of. In other words, I think that this is God now acting in a very direct sort of way. In fact, that's the way Joshua writes it. The Lord himself throws these hailstones down at him in order to kill them. Yes, he uses a thunderstorm, which develops the hailstones, but as part of his ordination, he's actually the one throwing these large stones down, acting in a direct way to kill these enemies of Gibeon. Look, you can certainly agree with the naturalistic explanation of the fact that they all ran away in fear, but it's getting harder to accept the idea that some sort of naturalistic thing is happening here. It's getting harder to believe that. In other words, I think the Lord is acting more obviously in this situation. So the first time, okay, you might dismiss it, but the second time it's getting harder to dismiss. Well, the third intervention makes it almost impossible to dismiss. It says that the Lord elongates sunlight to allow Israel time to finish the job. This is all of verses 12 to 14. Joshua spoke to the Lord in that day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of God, quote, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon," unquote. And the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jashar? The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There's been no day like it before or since when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Somehow, in some way, the sun remains above the horizon and visible in the sky over the fight for 24 hours, a whole day, Joshua notes, until Israel is able to finish the job of destroying all of the Amorites. In other words, the intention of this request is for daylight to proceed so that the Israelites in daylight can go and finish the job of destroying all of the Amorites that were left as a result of escaping the hailstones. And Joshua asks for that time in order that none are able to escape under the cover of darkness, which is precisely probably what many of them were hoping for, to be able to just get away when it got dark. The Lord keeps the sun in the sky. Now, how this occurred is unknowable. There's no way to know. I mean, did the Lord slow down the rotation of the earth here so that the sun stayed in the same spot over the sky, or be slowed it down so dramatically that it literally took 24 hours from it to go from sun up to sundown? Don't know. Or did he shift the rotation of the earth in such a way that the pole of the earth now ran directly through Canaan, such that the spin of the earth upon its axis would keep the sun in the sky, just the same sort of way that happens in Alaska in the middle of June, when the tilt of the earth causes the sun to remain overhead for the entire day and never sets? Don't know. There's no way to know. There's nothing in this text that tells us how. I will be wanting to ask that question when we get there. Now, the naturalistic explanation here, okay, some will try and they will say, well, the Israelites just perceived that it took 24 hours. I mean, it just felt like one of those situations like when you're staring at the microwave. You know, you plug in 2 minutes and then you sit there and stare at it, and it seems like it takes 8 hours for that bag of popcorn that you have inside to finish popping, right? If you walk away and go into the other room to do something, the thing dings before you think it's supposed to be done. But if you just stand there and watch it, so there's this perception. Some would say, well, that's all. They were just perceiving it that way. But Joshua makes an interesting comment here. He says, is this not written in the book of Jashar? It's a rhetorical question designed to help make his point. We don't know what the book of Jashar is, but it's highly likely that it's some sort of book of history that had been written outside the confines of Israel. There's no mention of Jashar anywhere within Israelite writings. Not even extant Israelite writings do we have anything related to this book of Jashar. We don't know what it is, but Joshua is referring to it as though it exists, and therefore it is making a notation that this occurred. So what Joshua is appealing to is this. We weren't the only ones to see this happen. Because if in fact the Lord did elongate a day so that the sun remained in the sky for a full 24 hours, it wouldn't be just in Canaan that this would be noticed. This would also be noticed in Mesopotamia. This would also be noticed in Egypt. This would also be noticed in the far-flung reaches of civilization. They would have all have seen it. And so what Joshua says rhetorically is, look, you know it happened because it's recorded in this other book. Other peoples noted it as well. So this was perceived by others and recorded, thus Joshua's question. God intervenes in a way that is without explanation, naturalistically, humanistically. There's no way to explain this other than just a flat-out act of God, whereby he causes the sun to remain above the horizon for a full 24-hour period so that Joshua can complete the work of destroying the Amorites. Now let me just note something that commentators struggle with, and that is the way this is written, the way what I just read is written. You might get the perspective that it's Joshua himself who orders the sun to stand still in the sky, and that it is God who obeys him in the process. Because that's how it's written, right? It looks that way. It looks as though Joshua was bragging about the fact that he went to the Lord at the beginning of that particular day and said, okay, Lord, I want the sun to stand firm in the sky, so I'm going to go outside and order it to be. And he writes about the idea that the Lord obeyed him. But I don't get the impression from anything else in this book that Joshua has that kind of character. That he would simply assume that he can go and command the sky to stop and God obeys him. That doesn't make sense to the rest of the way Joshua acts in this book. And more specifically, the way that God himself often comes to Joshua and says, this is what's going to happen, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is how it works. This would be utterly contradictory to the rest of the book. There's a better explanation here. At the very beginning of verse 12, it says that Joshua spoke to the Lord. Joshua went to the Lord. This could very well imply that Joshua went that day, at the beginning of that day, knowing that his forces were going to have to come against these enemies, went to the Lord to seek his advice on what to do. May have been because he didn't do that in making a covenant with the Gibeonites and might have learned his lesson. Maybe I need to go and seek the Lord. And when going to the Lord, it was Yahweh himself who actually instructed him to do this. I give you an example from Moses, going all the way back to Exodus chapter 7 and verses 8 and following. Moses is going to go and stand before the Pharaoh. He's not exactly sure what to say. And so the Lord says to him, look, here's what I want you to do. When you get there, just throw your staff down on the ground. Okay. So Moses walks into the presence of Pharaoh. He takes his staff. He throws it in front. What happens? Turns into a serpent. Moses commands the staff to turn into a serpent. But who did it? It was the Lord God who had done this in front of Pharaoh in order for Moses' words to be taken, to be understood by the Pharaoh as words coming from Yahweh, not from himself, from the Lord of the Israelites. So when Joshua writes that God heeded him, it's better to say that God heeded the voice of Joshua as a part of what he had purposed to do with Gibeon in the first place. Joshua, I want you to stand there and command the sun to stop. And guess what? I'm going to make it stop, and then you're going to do what I need you to do with these Amorites. I have set you aside to be the one to destroy them. The Lord obeys no one but himself. The assumption that God acts on our request is preposterous. He does not. If we believe that God is sovereign over all things, as the king of all the earth, then he can only obey his own commands. Yes, we may enter into his presence and ask him to do things. And he may at times say, I grant your request, but it's only because it's a part of what he has purposed to do in the world, specifically for his ends and for his glory. Therefore, especially for those of us who know him through Christ as our advocate, are able to approach his throne with great boldness and make our requests known unto him, but he will answer in accordance with his will. In this case, Joshua came, and the Lord put it upon his heart to say, ask for the sun to stand still, and I will grant that, because I have a purpose in it. Now, what is this 15 verses, or 14 as we've looked at them so far? We'll get to 15 next week. What do these 14 verses teach us? What do we want to learn from this? I would suggest to you that the lesson you should take away from this, if anything, is that the Lord fights for his own. The Lord fights for his own. How does God respond to the actions of the reprobate? How does God respond to the actions, the continuing rebellion of the reprobate? We learn from Romans chapter 1 and verse 18 that God responds to the reprobate by bringing forth his wrath. For the wrath of God is revealed, present tense, from heaven, right? God is responding to reprobation. Make no mistake, God is not standing there watching the reprobate shake their fist at him without responding. Oh, he is responding. His wrath is coming. How does he do this? Well, look at what he did here and see the parallels even in our own day. First, he sends paralyzing fear amongst them. I cannot escape this thought. You may not agree with me, but I cannot escape it. That the massive paralysis of fear that is being experienced in the West is directly related to the judgment of God that has now come upon the very same people who shake their fist at him in every other imaginable way. What does he send? He sends a fear amongst them. Maybe God has his messengers going throughout the earth and whispering in men's ears, you're going to die. You're going to die. We already know that, but what is one of the things that we suppress? We suppress the knowledge of our own mortality, don't we? We don't think about it. We don't want to think about it. As I've gotten older, I find myself thinking a lot more about the idea of being dead. But for those of you who are in your 30s, you're probably like, especially, ones like that over there that are young, they're probably thinking, I've got my whole life ahead of me. They're not even remotely thinking about the fact that they're going to die. What do? We suppress the knowledge of our own mortality. So what does God do to the reprobate? He sends a messenger. You're going to die. Oh, and by the way, you're going to die from that. And then secondly, he may at times, and I emphasize the word may, he may at times send direct forms of punishment into the very world of the reprobate. He may send to them no relief from the consequences of their own sin. Now, at times, God may restrain the consequences of sin. God may say, you know what? These people have rebelled against me, but I still have a purpose for them. I still have something I'm going to accomplish. But there may be times, as a part of God lifting his hand, producing judgment, that restraint means, guess what? You're going to get exactly what you want and what you deserve. And punishment falls. Punishment comes. It is unfortunate that God often sweeps up the righteous with the unrighteous, but that's only because God's not intending for this world to be the final goal of his plan. This is a corrupted, fallen, death-filled world. The kingdom is what he's establishing. So he may, in fact, send forms of great punishment. But most importantly, he sets an everlasting day of wrath over them. There is a day coming when the sun will never set, and those who are in rebellion against God will be brought into the light, and their deeds will be revealed as to who they truly are. Mark 4:22, John 3:19. And these who are reprobate will spend an eternity hating God and receiving his justice over them for their continuing rebellion. It will be a day when the sun will never set. The wrath of God will come unceasingly against a people who will, in their hatred of him and his law, rebel against him. His wrath will come and come and come, and there will never be a day when they will escape it. There will never be a sunset of that day when the wrath will stop. But how does God respond to the elect? How does God respond to those who belong to him, that he has set aside to himself? Well, my friends, our God fights for them. First, our God sends amongst the elect a spirit of assurance and peace, because they know his promises. They've heard the promises that he has made over them. They know that this world is full of trouble and trials and tribulations and pains and sufferings, disease and death. But they are waiting for another kingdom that's been promised to them. They have assurance and peace. God sends messengers amongst them. Sometimes they're angels, and sometimes they stand behind wooden boxes and preach to them. There is a day that God has established in which we will all have eternal peace with him. But he also, at times, may send forms of direct blessing upon us. After all, if sin has consequence, grace has consequence as well. And some of the greatest gifts that God has ever sent to us are things like peace and assurance and forgiveness and long-suffering and steadfastness and faith in the midst of whatever it is that God has sent to us. Yes, there are times when God will miraculously heal, but there are far more times when God will not, in which he will allow us to continue to walk the path that he has set before us and fill us with faith and trust. He will give us his word, and he will give us the church, and he will give us messengers that will help us to keep our eyes fixed upon him in the midst of our trials, tribulations, and so forth. He gives us great gifts. But thirdly, and most importantly, he sets an everlasting day of glory over them. There's coming a day where they will come into the unparalleled light of Christ Jesus himself. They will come into a day in which they will spend an eternity enjoying the presence of the Lord and receiving his love and compassion for their continuing joy. There is coming a day when the sun will never set. But this sun is spelled S-O-N rather than S-U-N. It is a day in which the very Son of God himself will be the light of a people. Revelation chapter 22, verse 5. It will be an unending day of glory. It will be an unending day in which we will spend with him, with Christ. And what will matter to us more than anything else is him, his presence, his love, his mercy, his compassion. We will look upon the scars in his flesh, and we will remember what he has done for us, and we will celebrate. Oh, it will be a celebration like anything that has ever been perceived on this planet. There will be singing of a nature that will never be comparable in this world, because we will be in this everlasting day of glory. You see, our God fights for us. And this brings us to our celebration of the Lord's Supper. And I'm always looking for a good segue from my sermon to the supper, but this one is easy. This one came to me 8 o'clock Monday morning. Our God fights for us, agreed? And where did that fight occur? On the cross. Our God sent His only begotten Son into the world to fight the greatest battle that could ever be waged in the history of humanity. We have a tendency to overlook that, I think. We have a tendency to see the mission of Christ in other kinds of terms. But probably the best way for us to really think about what Jesus did is the very Son of God, infinitely higher than any human person, robed Himself in flesh. That's the first element of the fight. He had to make a journey from the infinite side of His Father to the finite nature of a child conceived in the womb of a virgin and born into the world. That in and of itself is a massive victory. Massive fight. But then not only did He have to be born, but then He had to live in this world. And we know what this world is like, don't we? We know what this world has in it. We know it has filled with temptation and sorrow and suffering and pain and anguish and all the other kinds of things that make up the human experience. And He had to live in that condition. He had to walk around on this planet and He had to deal with Satan in ways that you have never dealt with Satan. He had to look the ancient serpent in the face and deal with him in the course of living out a perfectly sinless life. That flesh had to fight against the wiles and the temptations of the devil. But then He also had to go to the cross. The one who was born into this world perfect and sinless, and who Himself would never die, gave Himself over to the forces of evil, wicked men, such that they might nail Him to a cross. And He had to endure upon that cross the totality of God's wrath that was established against the sins of the elect. He had to take upon Himself the fullness of God's wrath, bear it in Himself for us, so that we would not ultimately to perish under the weight of that wrath. But the victory itself is secured, of course, Sunday morning when the stone is rolled away and this one comes from the grave in victory. Now, because you were all distracted by that little bit of whatever, I'm going to say that again. Because I think about 10% of the congregation heard it. So let me say it again. Where was the victory won? The victory was won when the stone was rolled away. When this one who had come down from his Father, lived in human flesh, dealt with all the realities of this world, gave Himself over to the wickedness of a cross in order to bear the entirety of the wrath of God, walked out of that tomb alive. Our God fought for us by becoming a man, living among us, dying on a cross, rising from the dead. You see it? The victory was His. He took on the conditions. He gave Himself over for His blood to be shed, and He rose from the dead. So as we approach the table, we are in fact coming to remember this fight and this victory. We are not coming to the table to take some sort of elements that might infuse some sort of special grace within us as some sort of special thing. No. I know there are many who think like that around the table, but We understand that this table means that we're coming to remember not ourselves or not anything in us, but something outside of ourselves, specifically in Him and what He did. We approach the bread, and as we take of this bread, we are reminded of that body that the Son of God took upon Himself, that He robed Himself in flesh, entered into this world, and lived a holy, sinless life in the face of unimaginable temptation. And then we take this cup, and we're reminded that this same one who had robed Himself in flesh now went to a cross, and His blood was shed so that those who had been given to Him by the Father would be satisfied before God. Justification would come. Righteousness would be exuded upon them. They would be imputed with His righteousness as He took that blood to His Father and offered it as a perfect sacrifice. And as we come together approaching the table, we come to remember that this one rose from the dead. The only reason that any of us are here is because that one rose from the dead. And we come to remember the fact that Jesus lived, and we come to remember that Jesus died, but we come to remember that Jesus rose from the dead, because that, my friends, is our hope. Our hope is not in the elements. Our hope is what He did on that Sunday morning, and what He has promised to do for all of us who will come to Him with nothing but an empty hand of faith and say, I have nothing to give you, O God, except what Christ has accomplished for me. I am saved by the victory He had over sin and death. And His victory is mine. Our God fights for us. Our God fights for us. Our God hasn't just announced the good news of the gospel and then said to us, well, if you want to come, come. I'll just leave it to you. Just, do what you want to do. No. Our God has come and He fights for us. And I would argue as well that when we come to this table, we're also being reminded that our God fights for us every single day to hold us fast to Himself, to keep us as His own. Christ made it clear, all that the Father has given me will come to me, and I will lose nothing. Christ stands at the side, sits at the right hand of His Father, and He looks into the Father's face and says, this one is mine. He will never be lost.